Okay, I uploaded this video to archive.org almost 2 years ago because my YouTube channel had 2 strikes at the time that I made it, and I just didn't want to take any chances, given the environment that existed on YouTube at that time as it related to potential medical misinformation, even though this video doesn't in any way relate to that, really. I said the words COVID and vaccine, so I just didn't take any chances with it. But in any event, I'm going to upload it to YouTube now at the end of this recording. And some of you might watch it and think that it's outdated because I'm describing things in the moment as it existed 2 years ago. And some of the things that I discussed that we were considering back then haven't quite come to fruition in the way that we were describing them 2 years ago. And I can see how people would use that as a way to discredit what we were talking about. Oh, you guys were talking about digital IDs and social credit scores and how they were going to use this vaccination campaign to create some of that. And that didn't transpire in the way that you guys said it was going to. So you must have just been way off base. However, I'm going to now, against your will, give you a history lesson. And we're going to go to this Wikipedia page for the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the first worldwide intergovernmental organization whose principal mission was to maintain world peace. And we will, of course, view the phrase world peace as an Orwellian form of speech here. It was founded on January 10th, 1920 by the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War. The main organization ceased operations on April 20th, 1946, but many of its components were relocated into the new United Nations. When you look at the map of the countries involved in the original League of Nations after World War I, you will see one country that is missing from the membership ranks here, which is, of course, the United States of America. Our Congress at the time did not allow us to join the League of Nations. My point is, if you were alive in 1920 and we had the internet and everyone was discussing the League of Nations and what they had planned for it, what its design was, and the United States didn't join at the time, many people would look at it in the same way and say, oh, see, you guys were talking about all this stuff that they wanted to do with this, and it couldn't even prevent the Second World War. And we didn't even get involved in it. So what are you talking about? Why are you trying to make me concerned with these things? Well, look at what transpired in the aftermath. 20 years later, they orchestrated a Second World War. And after that Second World War, the sentiment was there for the U.S. capitulation, where it was unanimously agreed by our congressional bodies that, okay, hey, we're going to join this new League of Nations in the form of the United Nations. These things take time and they don't always succeed right away, but that doesn't mean that the agenda goes away. You think because the United States didn't join the League of Nations that those who were orchestrating these kinds of things behind the scenes, leading to their desired outcome of a world governmental structure, you think they just gave up when the United States didn't join at first? No, of course not. They didn't give up. They just were patient and they waited for their opportunity to make it undeniable that this thing that they were proposing needed to exist. And in that way, I hope you'll be able to see how this GreenPass video is very relevant to what is still planned for the future, especially as it relates to news items like this one that came out today. World on thin ice as UN climate report gives stark warning. This is from March 20th, 2023. Humanity still has a chance, close to the last, to prevent the worst of climate change's future harms, a top United Nations panel of scientists said Monday. But doing so requires quickly slashing nearly 2/3 of carbon pollution by 2035. 2/3 of carbon pollution. That is a lot. The United Nations chief said it more bluntly, calling for an end to new fossil fuel exploration and for rich countries to quit coal, oil, and gas by 2040. Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once." Stepping up his pleas for action on fossil fuels, Guterres called for rich countries to accelerate their target for achieving net zero emissions to as early as 2040, which is 17 years away, and developing nations to aim for 2050, about a decade earlier than most current targets. He also called for them to stop using coal by 2030 and 2040, respectively, and ensure carbon-free electricity generation in the developed world by 2035, meaning no gas-fired power plants either. That date is key because nations soon have to come up with goals for pollution reduction by 2035, according to the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's like anything else. They're about to vote on the amount of emissions they're going to mandate by law have to be reduced in all of the member nations of the United Nations and all of the member nations of the Paris Climate Accords. So it's like a local election where they're really ramping up the rhetoric that will kind of force these countries into the actions that they want to see them take. Oh, you're about to vote on that? Oh, hey, by the way, we're all going to die if you don't do that. It's so obvious, but after contentious debate, the UN science report approved Sunday concluded that to stay under the warning limit set in Paris, the world needs to cut 60% of its greenhouse gas emissions by 2035, compared with 2019, adding a new target not previously mentioned in 6 previous reports issued since 2018. Obviously, as a part of cutting emissions by 60%, the population itself will have to be involved, and your individual carbon footprint will have to be measured and monitored in real time. Otherwise, nothing like this will ever be possible. Anyways, that's enough of that. I'll put in the GreenPass video now. This is a screenshot from Bill Gates' most recent AMA on Reddit, during which he was asked the question, "Any comment on the opinions of our conspiracy about you and vaccines?" "I am innocent," Bill Gates responds. "The whole thing about 5G and microchips is pretty crazy. Why would I want to do that?" Now, first of all, keep in mind that this account says this is Bill Gates, but it's most likely not the old man you see on television sitting here actually responding to these questions. It's probably more likely someone affiliated with his organization that is up to speed on every nuance of Reddit and internet culture who is here responding to all of these questions. In the same way that it's probably not Donald Trump himself, the almost 80-year-old man who is on Twitter all day long leaving tweets when he was president anyway. That was probably someone else affiliated with the Trump organization and likewise familiar with meme culture who was doing all of that. Regardless, this is the response attributed to Bill Gates, where he says, "I am innocent." But I want you to notice right away the nature of controlled opposition and how it works. Because the reason Bill Gates, or the account attributed to him, chose to respond to this question is because it was left in a really broad way where the whole forum, our conspiracy, is mentioned here in relation to the opinion of conspiracy theorists on Bill Gates and vaccines. So it's a real generalized statement. And the idea here is that the response will cover all of the chatter that's out there on the internet about Bill Gates and the conspiracies behind this vaccine agenda. And what does he choose to respond with? Well, he picks a very specific conspiracy theory that's floated out there, which is that there are being some kind of microchips or nanotechnology put into the vaccines without your knowledge, and that this nanotechnology is somehow designed to operate within the context of the new 5G infrastructure that has been put up all around us in the past couple years. That's a very specific idea that is out there. And it's one that has very little basis in reality. Not to say that this type of thing isn't going on or it's not possible. It's just one of those ideas that is so far out there as it relates to what most people would consider possible that it's easily discredited. And that's why he chooses to mention it without any prompting. Right? He doesn't choose to say, the idea that mRNA is an unproven technology that's brand new and has failed in all animal trials that it was tried on in the past, that's pretty crazy. No, he doesn't say that. He chooses this one example that is kind of outlandish when you first hear something like that, and is probably not happening here. Even though there is truth, of course, to the impact of 5G on our bodies and our energy fields, in the same way that all of this technology and the electromagnetic radiation interacts with our personal energetic fields and can have all kinds of lasting impacts on us over time if we are exposed to these sorts of things on an ongoing basis. So you can see the effectiveness of controlled opposition. You have your agents on the internet promoting ideas like these, that this is the real agenda behind the vaccines, and then in an AMA that is targeting a more neutral observer, an observer that is more unaware and hasn't been researching all of this for years and years and years. In their mind, you have just discredited the idea of there being any kind of ulterior motives here with the vaccine in one sentence or a couple sentences. The question is posed, any comment on the opinions of our conspiracy about you and vaccines? Well, that kind of covers all of conspiracy theory in the mind of somebody who doesn't involve themselves in it and know all the ins and outs of it on a daily basis. This is a blanket statement, and then the response is, I am innocent. The whole thing about 5G and microchips is pretty crazy. Why would I want to do that? What would be my motive? You see, this stuff is nuts. Then he says, I do believe in vaccines which have performed miracles. My 2015 TED Talk was more viewed after the pandemic than before, which is too bad. I hope my 2010 TED Climate Talk is viewed more before the problem gets bad. Now, if we know, based on all of the documents and information that was put out there, especially relating to the simulations that were run as drills leading up to the event, we can see that Bill Gates, because he is a part of the agenda and knows what is going to happen, and this adds to his credibility as someone who knows what they're talking about. Well, in 2015, he was talking about the danger of a pandemic, how we need to be prepared for the pandemic that is surely coming. But of course, he knew this one was coming. And I just want you to see how we have this parallel between 2015 and his TED Talk and what happened in 2020 and this year with COVID-19. And now he's adding his 2010 TED climate talk in this context as well. Well, you see, I was right about pandemics, and I'm going to be right about the climate change issue. So you really should be listening to what I'm saying along these lines. The problem, of course, is that people have sort of seen through a lot of the information that was put out there about global warming. The agenda has been exposed pretty thoroughly, to the point where they actually had to rename in the media how they referred to it. They went from global warming to climate change, because you can't discredit the term climate change, because our climate is always changing. It changes every day. And then if you think of that in terms of trends, well, we have seasonal climate change. And then, of course, we would have broader climate change. And they are aware of all this information. They know the cosmic cycles. They know how the climate is going to change. Plus, then you have the geoengineering angle to the issue, where they're able to influence climates in certain areas, maybe influence a drought in this area, or a flood in this area, or conditions that would lead to flooding. You know, on and on it goes. You can see how they would be able to use the idea of climate change as a way to then say, hey, look at what human beings are doing to the climate. It's getting more and more severe. And then on top of that, you have the role that technology plays in our lives, where we are connected to the news that's happening around the world in a way that we never have been before, or presumably we never have been before in the past few thousand years at least. For all we know, severe weather events are just as common now as they were thousands of years ago. It's just we have access to real-time reporting of severe climate events all over the world. Any part of the world that something like this happens, an earthquake, for example, or a hurricane, a tornado, mudslides, tsunamis, I mean, you name it, that stuff is instantly reported, and that trend is only intensifying over time, where we have this real-time access and in-depth reporting of events like this. But thousands of years ago, or even 300 years ago, before we had this sort of interconnectivity, I mean, something that happened in Asia, it would take weeks, months for it to reach America, for us to become aware of a flood that happened there. So I hope you can see how that is playing into this climate change narrative as well. And then on top of that, yes, it does seem as if the weather is more unpredictable. The climate is changing, and that goes into the geoengineering aspect of this, of whatever they're putting into the atmosphere is doing to the climate. And then you just have on top of that the natural changes in the climate cyclically. And those changes can be incremental on a daily basis, or they can be seasonal, or they could be more cosmically aligned to the planets and the stars and the magnetic poles, and just the way that the whole environment on Earth is functioning. That could influence the climate as well. So all of these factors are coming together, and they know all of this information, and they know how easy it is to control people when you appeal to their emotions. So you put all of this together, and what do we get? Well, we get the green agenda. We get the climate change narrative that's coming out of the United Nations and all the other supranational organizations that are pushing for a world response to this huge problem, because, of course, this is a way to integrate nation states all following one set of guidelines, because that's a precursor to world government. This is how they get their foot in the door to reduce national sovereignty, because they say this problem is bigger than any one nation, and we cannot allow any one nation to prevent us from solving this quote-unquote crisis, because the future of humanity is at stake, or so they tell us in this context. And I hope you see the very identical nature of that narrative to what is going on with COVID-19 and the vaccinations right now. This is what they say. Don't you want to get back to normal? Don't you want to save our way of life? Well, if you want that, you got to get this vaccine. That's the only way it's going to get back to normal. And so in that context, they push the vaccination passport agenda as a way to prove digitally that you are a part of the solution. And if you're a part of the solution in that way, they will let you back into society. And so you can see where this is going many years in advance. But also just see how the narrative is identical and how one country cannot remove itself from the vaccination agenda because then it's doing the same thing. It's preventing the world from solving this great crisis that is COVID-19. Accordingly, you go to famous documents like the Limits to Growth that came out of the Club of Rome, where they say, in searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap which we have already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. And so this underlying agenda was sort of exposed decades ago to where people became aware of what was going on. And so they've had all kinds of problems getting people to change their behaviors, attitudes, habits in response to this. And sure, they have some success here and there. You have the increasing popularity of some of these facets of this agenda, and those are the ones that are constantly promoted in the news. But still, there isn't that critical inflection point where they've been able to tip the scales and get everyone on board with this agenda. And again, this was part of President Trump's role as the conspiracy theorist president. What was one of the first things he did? Well, he pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords. And then now that he's been tarred and feathered through their other psychological operations as a domestic terrorist, well, they've associated domestic terrorism with being a quote-unquote climate science denier. And so they've associated everything with the conspiracy theorist president along those lines. That's why it was done. That's why he was put into office. So why am I discussing all of this? Why am I talking about the green agenda in the context of Bill Gates and the vaccine agenda? Well, it's pretty simple. What are they calling the vaccination passports? The GreenPass. Or in Europe, the digital green certificate. Now, I need you to stop and really think about this for a second. Of course, there is the superficial explanation on the surface that they would use to explain this to people. They would say, well, yes, we think in terms of green means go, red means stop, yellow means caution. This is from our exposure to traffic lights. This is how we all think. So we named it the digital green certificate or the green pass because we're saying this is the digital proof that you have a negative COVID test or you have been vaccinated. And so you have a green light, metaphorically. You can go interact in society again. But think of it a little more deeper. Think of it in terms of, after 9/11, the response to quote-unquote terrorism. What did they name the organizations that were set up by the Patriot Act? Did they name it the Department of Terrorism? Did they name it the Federal Bureau of Terrorism Investigation? No, of course not. They named it the Department of Homeland Security. Why? Because Homeland Security as a concept will never change. There will never be a reason to remove it because Homeland Security is something that everybody always wants in this, mainstream thought form that everyone is plugged into. Why did they do that? Because they knew when the terrorism angle lost its power, when it stopped being able to influence everyone, they would not lose the Department of Homeland Security in the process. It would stay because it would be able to shift its purpose for being around. Its name wouldn't be attached to the event that created it. So I hope you see how the same thing is happening here. Do you think it's a coincidence that these vaccine passports that are a response to COVID-19 are being called digital green certificates or green passes? Why wouldn't it be called the COVID-19 pass? The COVID-19 vaccine pass? I mean, they even say here, the digital green certificate is just a fancy term for vaccination pass. Why aren't they just calling it the COVID vaccination pass? Because, as many people have been trying to relay to everyone, this is just the start of something. This is what they do. This is the formula. Because this is going to exist well after COVID-19 has left the news cycle. I mean, assuming it ever does leave the news cycle, I don't know. They could turn it into a yearly thing where you got to get your yearly booster for the COVID-19 vaccination because, hey, it's a coronavirus and it mutates every year like the flu now. But anyway, it's going to exist well after COVID-19. You have to think in terms of decades and many, many, many moves ahead. In other words, you can see how the digital green certificate or the green pass 10 years from now will encompass something entirely different than just proof that you were vaccinated for COVID-19 or have a negative COVID-19 test. We can see how it would start to include your carbon footprint and other social credit score type things. It would be a part of that whole apparatus that would rate you as a citizen in the eyes of the state. So sure, right now we're referring to it as a green pass and everybody knows that it's referring to COVID-19. 20 years from now, everyone would be referring to a green pass in a much different context. What is your carbon footprint? Oh, you did this and emitted this much carbon when you did it, so now you can't go anywhere for 3 weeks until you are carbon neutral. And you can even see they started floating little ideas like this where they came out and said, oh, hey, we're floating this idea of being taxed by the mile in America as a part of the agenda that they're putting out there. Yes, as a part of this new law that will be passed, we're toying with the idea of taxing Americans by how many miles they drive. Think of it in those terms. That would be something that could be included in a digital app like this, which would log how many miles you drive, and it would have a record of it. And at first you're only taxed for it, but then of course it's like cigarettes or anything else that becomes exorbitantly expensive because of all the taxes that are associated with, because the taxes are designed to discourage you from consumption. So you could imagine a world where the tax per mile becomes so outrageous that only the rich can travel freely because they're the only ones who have the money to pay for the mile tax. And of course, don't take that as fear-mongering because something like that is 20 years in the future. They have to start real slow. It'd be a minor toll in the beginning. But you see how these things are planned this way. My point being that the digital green pass, like it's being used in Israel right now, is the blueprint for how something like this will be implemented in society on a broader scale, on a more restrictive scale as we progress, as they use their media to convince us that things are getting worse and worse and more dire action is needed. But in order to do that, they had to get their foot in the door, and this is how they did it. Again, it's like destroying the planet. Who's going to argue with Grandma potentially dying because of this deadly pandemic that's going on? Of course, you need to get vaccinated, and so you don't endanger everyone else, you need to prove that you've been vaccinated to go out in public now. It's the only way we can return to normal. But of course, that's not normal. We didn't used to have to scan something to get in to everywhere that we went. That's a new normal, I hope you see. And if we take our lessons from history, we know that the new normal never goes away. So don't let someone convince you that this is no big deal and isn't something that should be opposed on every level imaginable. So I just wanted to get into that about the GreenPass and how they so obviously named it. It's blatant.